Welcome to the McFeely Mess Podcast at Inforum.com. In-depth conversations and opinion covering a variety of topics from the world of news, sports, and more. Here's Mike McFeely.
Welcome to another episode of the McFeely Mess Podcast at Inforum.com. Broadcasting, or narrowcasting, whichever way you want to phrase it, on Wednesday morning, October 2nd, the morning after the vice presidential debate between Democrat Tim Walz and Republican J.D. Vance. And that is just one of the several topics that we're going to cover with Forum reporter Tasha Carvell this morning on The Mess. Good morning.
Good morning.
How are you?
I'm well, thank
You're
you.
bright and bushy-tailed.
I am.
Bright-eyed and bushy-tailed.
I am. You know what? My beat is crime primarily, but I also cover some political stuff for the Forum. And it's been a weirdly quiet week on the crime front. So I've gotten extra sleep. I am less,
It has not been a quiet last several months on the crime beat.
No.
It has been...
No, it has been drinking from a fire hose
Yes.
from a crime perspective
Yes.
in the Fargo
Especially from
FM
serious, murders and killings standpoint, which is odd for this community.
It really is. So on Monday, I checked I always do this every Monday morning, check the jail rosters, check to see it was so dead, so quiet. So I called Ryan Youngren, who's with the state's attorney's office, and I said, am I missing something? What's going on? He said, something is happening, the cycles of the moon or something, because he said on Monday mornings, we usually have to make charging decisions on about 20 cases, average Monday mornings after a weekend. And he said, this Monday we had 2.
Oh.
So something is, I don't know, good in the water where it's quiet. I don't know, back to school or fall or what. But anyway,
I don't know. That's odd. So
it is strange.
The negative of that would be is that just wait till all starts happening. Then it's going to be like a flood rushing down.
Right. I should, knock on wood as I'm saying.
Just enjoy the quiet when you can.
Exactly. So that's why I'm bright-eyed.
Excellent. So, a couple different things I want to touch on with you this morning, and they're all sort of different things for the most part, but the debate last night, we can touch on that a little bit. There's also a new poll out in the North Dakota United States Senate race between Kevin Cramer, the Republican incumbent, and challenger Katrina Christiansen, who is the Democrat, of course. And you were able to sit down with both of them, it was a couple weeks ago now, and a story just published recently on that. So we can talk about the poll, but also talk about what you learned from talking to those two candidates.
Sure.
And then also, I know a story that you've been working on for a while regarding an alleged large spill of fluid at the Dakota Access Pipeline site when Transfer Energy Partners was drilling.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of becoming more in focus now. And there was actually, I think, a national report out on it recently. And so we'll touch on all of those things.
Yeah,
so
sure.
We have to compartmentalize in our business these days because there's fewer of us, unfortunately. And so we all have to do 1,000 different things.
Yeah.
I know you can handle it.
I'm ready. I'm ready. Let's do this thing.
So I don't know how much attention you paid to the debate last night or whether you followed up this morning, but I watched the entire thing, which is 90 minutes of my life I will never get back because there just wasn't much going on. And maybe part of the reason I feel that way is because when you have Trump involved with something, it's just a S-show circus that is just like, bah! Like the last presidential debate was between Kamala Harris and Trump.
Yeah.
The vice presidential candidates last night actually kept things civil and was kind of boring because Tim Walz tried to talk policy too much, in my opinion. And J.D. Vance, frankly, just spewed out blocks of minutes of complete sewage BS, trying to make himself look normal and not hateable. But it just wasn't much happening. I don't know if you have any thoughts on what was going on or what.
Well, I will confess my debate watching strategy is is basically to go on X or Twitter or whatever it is and see what people are saying and then decide if I'm going to tune in. So essentially, so for example, during the Biden and Trump debate, I went on X and Twitter and tuned in, and I was also getting pinged with texts from friends who were watching like nonstop. And I said, I'm definitely not going to watch this because this sounds like an absolute disaster. So that one was easy, and then the debate between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, I did tune in after looking at Twitter a little bit and deciding that this one might be kind of entertaining to watch, and it was. And then last night's, it did just from Twitter sound like kind of a snooze fest. And also just a very stark contrast between a man who's very polished, a lawyer by trade,
J.D. Vance,
Ivy League educated, man, versus sort of more of a folksy Tim Walz, who isn't trained in this sort of affair and maybe was less polished in his delivery and things like that. So, it seemed like that was more of the thing. I saw, I guess Rob Port had a column today about Tim Walz calling himself a knucklehead at some point.
Yes, he did. It was about when he was in China and whether he was there during the Tiananmen Square situation, 30 years ago or whatever, 35 years ago now.
Yeah, but the point Port was making, which is an interesting one, is that Tim Walz showed some ability to have some shame about, a previous position he had and how rare and almost, unicorn-like that is in politics these days. So I thought that was kind of an interesting thing that happened. But yeah, otherwise, I heard Ken Martin, who's the chair of the Minnesota Democratic Party, say this morning on some radio show that J.D. Vance talked civilly about uncivil, otherwise uncivil platform for the entire time.
He everybody knows my political leanings, but he just lied. It wasn't. It was very civil lying, and yet he somehow got points for that because, he was so nice, and he said he agreed sometimes with Tim Walz,
called him his friend,
but listen to what he's saying, and the moderators at CBS. The network made the decision to not push back, and so they just sat there and.
Although at one point, I guess they did, and he said something like, "I thought you guys weren't going to.
I thought you were going to fact check me,"
which seems like such a crazy admission that.
But when they asked him, J.D. Vance, a question and they asked some pointed questions about things that he had said, things that he did, but he would just throw out 500 words of nothing. And then then smile and say, hey, buddy, and it was so odd.
Right. Well,
and as you referenced, Tim Walz, he's not the guy to like Kamala Harris would have absolutely shredded Vance to pieces, but Walz didn't quite know how to respond and I didn't think pushed back strong enough on some of the lies and just the obvious what are you talking about? The alternate reality that J.D. Vance was trying to present. Later on, Walz kind of found his groove a little bit and was a little bit more assertive in calling BS on some of what Vance was saying. But by that time, it was like, what had happened here? But
too little, too late.
Too little, too late, in my view. I'm sitting in my living room going, don't let him say that.
I don't think you should let your blood pressure go up so high over a vice presidential debate, though, right?
I'm into it, man.
I'm know.
Just the future of the country's at stake, so I don't know why I'm so worried about it. I just
am not certain that we know how many swing voters are basing their votes on the vice presidential.
Right, correct.
The one vice
and they're not,
debate.
Whatever I write or say is going to sway nobody because if you go to Facebook or Twitter or whatever, that's where people are getting their information about this stuff, and it just wants me to stick a pencil in my eye. But
the undecided voter polls afterward, though, had Walz winning. Like NBC did one, and I think one of the newspapers did one, and maybe the Washington Post, and it's hard to find an undecided voter these days. Apparently, the NBC one I think had 6.
Do you believe that there are?
There are any undecided
voters out there? Because CBS, before the debate started, yes, I watched the pregame. God, I'm sad. But they had a number of quote-unquote undecided voters, and I just kind of went, listening to what they said.
You were skeptical.
I said, but are you undecided? Because the things you say you're concerned about are literally every talking point of the Republican campaign. Oh, the economy, and immigration, and well, I mean, are you undecided then?
Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting question, and I think a fair one. I think there are people who maybe decide and then change their minds. I think that's like the swing voters. Like, I feel like maybe they've decided today, but tomorrow they might hear something that will, they're very easily
persuadable,
easily swayed. And so
Okay.
I think that those people could change their minds up until election day every single day, and that those might be that's the only thing I can really think of, because you're right. I mean, if you're going by what they say they care about, then they should have made up their mind by now.
At least based on the tone I was getting from them. I don't know a Democratic voter that would list immigration as their number one concern.
Sure.
And so when somebody says it's like, well, okay, so
my guess
are you
is
really
you're gonna vote
undecided
this
then?
way.
Because you don't sound like somebody that I would hang out with, or I shouldn't say that. You don't sound like the people I hang out with who lean left, because that would not be their top concern.
Sure. I do think it is interesting, though, when you're saying that there's people like Jeff Flake, the former senator from Arizona, a Republican senator.
Very conservative, by the way.
I think, did he run for president once, maybe, or something? I feel like he maybe was in the mix at some point. Anyway, he just came out and endorsed Kamala Harris this week, which he's especially interesting to me because he's been kind of quiet, and I don't think it's typical. I think it was a bit of a surprise, right?
Yeah.
So I do think that if you ask people purely what policies they care about, undecided voters, and they say immigration, and then you think, well, they're obviously going to vote for Trump then, I think that there is room there for those people to still say, I'm undecided because I'm not sure about him. I'm not sure about the standard bearer, the guy who I'd have to actually check the box next to, because I think people like Jeff Flake might say immigration's a major concern for me too. He's a border state guy. He's on Arizona, right? And he might be legitimately top concern immigration too, but he has decided that there's something, and they're not asking these undecided voters maybe enough about the character of the candidates and how much that is weighing into their vote. So anyway,
fair enough. And these undecided voters happen to be from Michigan, by the way, which just, again, that's right.
Right, for them to be listing immigration.
So you're worried about the Canadians coming down, or what? So anyway, okay. Okay.
Although if this helps us transition, I will say I asked Katrina Christiansen what the major issues that she thinks are the greatest concern, and she said the border crisis is one of two. For her,
and she's
which
hearing
is not
that,
immigration,
and she's hearing
specifically,
she's hearing that from residents of North Dakota as she travels around.
Yep.
Which you have to, as a candidate or as a politician, you have to respond to your constituents or your potential constituents. And
sure.
so, if she's at a cafe in Watford City, and 10 out of 10 people say, "Bow the border!"
Yeah, but
even though they have no reason to, and that's why it's like, really? Why? But
what I would say about that is, though, she wouldn't have necessarily had to use that one with me. Like, she wouldn't have had to say that to me. She also the second one was quality healthcare access, especially in rural communities,
and that's totally legit.
Yeah, for sure. And so, but the interesting thing is that she did say it, and she was very specific in saying, fentanyl coming into North Dakota communities, because of things that are happening at the border. So that was sort of, she made it a little bit more specific, but her talking point on that, which is very interesting, is that, Kevin Cramer had an opportunity to vote on a border bill that would have addressed a lot of those issues, and chose to vote against it because Donald Trump had asked all Republicans to vote against it because the border is an important issue for him, and this would have taken away that issue. So
this is how I know you were once in radio, is because you just, as you mentioned, that's a perfect transition to my next topic, which is polling across the statewide races. in North Dakota. We've seen a flurry of them. We call them internal polls, whether it was from the Kevin Cramer campaign or the Katrina Christiansen campaign or other candidates have released some polls.
Yeah.
Today, the North Dakota News Cooperative, which is sort of it is a nonpartisan news gathering umbrella organization, released a poll that is headlined, Republicans look set for sweep of top races in North Dakota, obviously.
This is hot off the presses, P.S. This came out at 11 a.m., and we're recording at what time?
Right, exactly.
Yeah,
right now it's 11:27, so it's pretty good. But to continue our conversation, this poll has Kevin Cramer at 51%, Katrina Christiansen at 29%, and the undecided block of voters, which is remarkable if this number is accurate, at 20%.
It's very high.
It's very high, is why I said that would be remarkable.
That's the highest undecideds I've seen by of a lot. Yeah.
Yes. Especially in a state like North Dakota, it's a very red state, and Kevin Cramer is he's a household name. A name ID for Kevin in North Dakota is probably 98%.
Yeah.
And he's been in office for 6 years in the Senate, and he's been a politician for 30, 40 years, whatever it's been.
Yep.
And so that number of undecideds is really high. But it sort of flies in the face of a couple of the internal polls that both Cramer and Christiansen have released recently, trying to get that narrative and get get those headlines saying, I'm ahead, no, I'm close, no, blah, blah, blah. It isn't really in line with either of the candidates' internal polling.
Right, and it's particularly fascinating because the pollster that the North Dakota News Co-op used for their poll is the same pollster that Kevin Cramer's campaign used for their poll.
I did not know that.
So that is especially fascinating. Kevin Cramer's poll, I think, polled from the 22nd to the 24th of September. This poll polled from the 28th to the 30th of September. So a week later, but the fact that this swung nearly 10 points in Christiansen's direction in a week by the same pollster is particularly remarkable. It would be sort of a shrug if it wasn't a different pollster, but it's the same polling company. So that's fascinating.
The North Dakota News Cooperative points that out in their article that they wrote for their website. It says the 22-point gap in this latest poll is closer than a recent poll commissioned by Cramer and conducted between September 22nd to 24. That poll, conducted by WPA Intelligence, that's the polling firm, showed him with a 29-point lead over Christiansen, as reported by Forum Communications on September 30th.
Okay, so it's a 7-point swing. But still, that's not insignificant of a swing, especially since I think this is a 4.5-point difference. So clearly, they're seeing some sort of mini swing within a week, and who knows what to attribute that to. What is really interesting is this poll was conducted the week Kevin Cramer's ads went up. Oh. So I don't know, maybe his ads are backfiring on him. I'm just looking at his ads went up September 23rd, I believe. And so I guess that first poll that he did was sort of in the middle of that. And then this one, his ads had been up for a full week and it swung over to her. So I don't know if that had anything to do with anything.
I have a minor in political science, and so I'm certainly no expert here, but it could be a number of things, right? It could be that there's you poll different people and you get different responses, right?
Yeah, the 500 people they polled a week ago.
Every political scientist will tell you that any poll is just a slice of time.
Sure.
You could poll the same group of people a week apart and you just get a 5-point difference, whatever it was.
Yep.
Or it could show the lack of accurate polling.
Yeah.
I mean, that has also been an issue, although, again, it's the same polling firm, but it's not an exact science. Number 3, it could be that Kevin Cramer's campaign is making up a bunch of stuff to make his numbers look better, even though I mean, a 21-point gap is
Yeah,
nothing to be ashamed about.
Right. Yeah,
he's going to win the race.
Yeah, it's still quite good for him.
But maybe they think 30% sounds better in a headline or something.
Sure.
I don't know.
And you look, this race is tightening. It's still far outside any sort of, question about who is likely to win. Although, when I spoke with them, Kevin Cramer first acknowledged that there will be tightening, and he thinks part of it is Kamala Harris being at the top of the ticket. He thinks that matters somehow, just with energizing voters. He said they're seeing it in Senate races all across the country, tightening in those races, some that they're actually more concerned about than they thought would be concerns at all.
Correct, yep.
He mentioned Indiana as one that was
Really?
potentially they got a little nervous.
Yeah, okay. Florida and Texas would be the two obvious ones you'd think about in that case, but Indiana's interesting.
Yeah.
I mean.
Yeah. So I thought that was interesting. But I think, look, this is far outside the realm of possibility, it looks like. But he said to me, what did he say? I want to make sure I don't misquote him, because it was sort of shocking that he said, who knows what's going to happen between now and the election? Maybe Donald Trump will start talking about eating elephants. He said that to me.
Okay.
It was not in my story, but he was sort of saying basically
What crazy thing is he going to say next?
Yeah, which I was sort of surprised, because he doesn't, typically sort of, he and Donald Trump have a very good relationship, but I think even Kevin Cramer is sort of starting to see that some of the things that Donald Trump is saying on the campaign trail might be hurting down ballot.
Yeah, well, as it should. I mean, they're eating the dogs. They're eating the cats.
Yeah, he said that on the record. So I didn't have it in my story, but he did say that on the record. So anyway, I thought that was interesting, and for people like Kevin Cramer to be acknowledging it means there's some concern there. I don't think there's any concern for him.
No, we need to also acknowledge that Katrina Christiansen released a poll.
Yes.
I want to say Tuesday morning, that showed her within 9 points.
Within 9
of Kevin Cramer, and Cramer's number under 50%, that's always a key number, because you need 50% to win a race in a two-person race.
Well, he's only at 51.
No, so that part, but within 9 points. And I wrote a column off of that poll that has yet to be published as we record this. And again, I'm coming from the left side of the aisle strongly. Wouldn't it be wonderful from my viewpoint if this was only a 9-point race? That's still way more of a gap than Katrina Christiansen could make up. I mean, that would still be a strong. Any other 9-point race around the country would go, well, that one's over.
Yeah.
And you would say that in this one too.
Yeah.
But from my standpoint, wouldn't it be wonderful if the race was that close? I just, with all due respect to Katrina, she's run a good campaign. She's a good candidate, maybe the best statewide candidate the Democrats have had since Heidi Heitkamp 6 years ago, whatever it was. But I just don't think it's within 9 points. I've lived here too long and followed this stuff too closely to ever think she's within single digits of Kevin Cramer.
Yeah, I'm skeptical as well. I mean, they all have their own pollsters. She uses Linda Lake, a Democratic pollster. They also release their methodology. They poll, I think, R plus 19, so 19 points more Republicans than, so, they try to make it but at the same time, every pollster does what they can to help their candidate feel better about their race.
They're being paid by that candidate.
Right.
They're a client of that candidate.
So I think that's right. Again, this race has tightened. There's no question. The first poll that came out in, I think, June was a Brighter Futures Alliance poll, a Republican PAC.
Pat Finken's deal.
Yep, and it was a 35-point lead for Cramer. And then, it has tightened since. And, I think Katrina, her first poll that came out, I think she was within 13. I think in that poll.
The question really is whether, and Cramer in his smug, condescending way referenced this to you, is that, he said, well, she'll be lucky to break 35%. That's really the number that those of us on the left side of the aisle are looking at, is what number can a Democrat get to statewide?
Right. That's right. That's the bar at this point. It's not a win.
Right.
Can they break 40, which would be a miracle.
Democrats want to break 40% in statewide races, and they can't do it because it's just that red of a state. And in many cases, frankly, they just haven't run good candidates. But I think Katrina's a good candidate. I think Trygve Hammer's a good candidate. And I'm not just saying that because, they have my viewpoints a lot of the time, but they're not going to come close to I don't think breaking. Maybe Katrina gets near 40%. I don't know, but that's just where Democrats are in North Dakota.
It would seem so. Yeah.
Right. Do you want to? You know what? We don't have really enough time to get to the story that we could have gotten to about the Dakota Access Pipeline.
Sure.
Can we save that until you actually are able to report that story out?
That'll be out by the next time we talk, for sure.
Published and people can digest it and mull it.
Right.
You went down this road a little bit a second ago, but is there you talked to both Kevin Cramer and Katrina Christiansen for a couple of stories that were in the forum over the weekend, I think, when I read them. Anything you could tell us from those conversations that stood out? I know you already shared one nugget that Cramer just hopes Trump doesn't start eating elephants or whatever he said he was going to do.
Right. Talking about that. Yeah.
Anything else that stands out from those conversations? Because as much as I shake my head at Kevin Cramer, he can be glib. He can say things. He
did talk about J.D. Vance quite a bit. I didn't include that in my story just because it didn't really have much to do with the Senate race in North Dakota. But he talked about he and J.D. Vance have clashed during their time as senators together. They're of such a different, and this is part of this Republican divide right now. I mean, J.D. Vance, I think Kevin Cramer even says he's the legitimate intellectual conscience of the populist movement, is what he called J.D. Vance, which I thought was interesting. And then Kevin Cramer just said, and I'm just not that way. That was how he sort of defined himself. He's sort of more of a traditional conservative, maybe, in his view.
Yeah, he's an evangelical right-winger from Kindred who, went to Concordia. He did not go to Yale. He did not come from money, and neither did J.D. Vance, but J.D. Vance made a gajillion dollars in the tech world.
Yeah.
And hangs with that crowd, by the way, and is incredibly intelligent. And not that Kevin isn't intelligent. I'm not saying that at all.
Yeah, they just come from very different
worlds that they come from.
100%.
And still hang out in, by the way.
Yeah.
They wouldn't hang out.
Oh, no. Yeah. I mean, he talked about a lot about how, this sort of new guard, Eric Schmidt from Missouri is another sort of J.D. Vance-like guy. And how Eric Schmidt, after I think it was the supplemental for the Ukraine, how all of the guys that voted against that, the Republicans that voted against that, were younger than 50. And everybody who voted for it were older than 50. How it sort of is an age gap. And, Cramer said something, he sort of responded to Eric Schmidt on Twitter. They've gotten a little Twitter battle. And said, I think the bliss of youthful naivety is what Kevin Cramer said back. And then J.D. Vance came back at Kevin Cramer and said something like, I really like you, Kevin, but it's your generation that gave us these endless wars and things like that. So these two guys have actually clashed on policy, not an insignificant amount, which is very interesting. And I asked about, the vice president's pick and how he felt and he said, I didn't even have to. Generally a senator should support another senator if they're, in the mix for. But he said we were off the hook because Doug Burgum was our guy. So
sure. Right. Yep.
And then he also talked a little bit about how truly, and this has been reported quite a bit, but I think Kevin Cramer can actually authenticate this because he does talk to Donald Trump a considerable amount, how close Doug Burgum was to being the pick and how he really really truly was the. And
one of Trump's kids, I think Don Jr. or somebody stepped in and said, no,
right.
We need Vance.
Right.
And that's
right.
so, yeah.
But he sort of validated how very close Doug Burgum was to being the pick.
That's interesting because, Kevin Cramer it's funny how he has become, and I've written this before and talked about it, but it's funny how Kevin Cramer, not through any changes in his ideology or viewpoints or votes, has sort of become the center of the Republican Party.
Isn't it interesting?
Because he was, I view Kevin Cramer as a far right, and he is. It's not just my view, he is.
Right.
A far right, evangelical, super conservative politician who doesn't have a filter. He's not diplomatic. He's, that's in him.
Yes.
And he's now viewing himself, and others are also viewing him as the Republican Party has moved so far right that he's the center of the party because he has He's like a super defense guy, which is one of the traditional, tenets of what we used to call, moderate Republicans was, America first, but we're going to take care of our allies.
We're still the superpower.
We're going to spend a lot of money on defense.
Yep, 100%.
We're going to take care of our defense contractors and their summer homes.
Yep.
We're going to do all of those things. But the new J.D. Vances and Eric Schmidts of the world are isolationists.
Yes, 100%.
I mean, they're just totally just stay out of it because we're not going to spend that money. We don't care what happens to Ukraine because it doesn't matter to us. And Kevin Cramer's a product of the Cold War, maybe.
Yeah. Ronald Reagan was the president when he was
Ronald Reagan was the iconic,
right, and still is for him.
And still is. Yep. And J.D. Vance and those guys are so young that Ronald Reagan doesn't factor into their lives at all, and his outlook and taking down the Berlin Wall and dissolving the Soviet Union.
Yeah, and Kevin Cramer is motivated by winning. He wants to win, and he knows, and he said this to me, we can't have, I think he said something about, these factions in our party are making it hard, and we need a bigger tent, not a smaller tent. He said that over and over and over again, and he's been doing that his entire career. Before he even was elected to office, when he was the party chair for the Republicans, he tells the story, and he told it again when we were talking. He appointed a pro-life and a pro-choice co-chairs of the platform committee for the convention when Ed Schaefer was running for governor the first time around, and it nearly caused a war. I mean, he said that Jim Casper wanted to kill him and things like that. And he, everybody was saying, you're flirting with disaster here, Kevin. And that the headline later when everything turned out and Schaefer got the nomination and there was a lot of unification. And then, of course, that was the start of the great run for Republicans in North Dakota, basically, was, the headline was that Cramer stuffs abortion genie back in bottle. So even he's probably one of the most anti-abortion candidates we've had in North Dakota ever, and been very open about that. But even he, because winning was so important to him, he was willing to sort of do that in order to unite the party.
Yes.
So he will do things like that to sort of put aside his own personal principles in order to win.
Opportunist would be one word that I have used to describe Kevin Cramer. Not saying that he wants to win, and this is a whole other podcast.
And fully acknowledges it publicly.
Yes,
that's what I think it would just is important to say.
Yeah, and what I'm going to do is tip my cap, because part of the problem with Democrats over the last X number of years is that they'd rather be right than win. Democrats politically and nationally would rather preach at you and tell you how they're right and you're wrong than actually win an election. And I'm sort of passionate about some things. I think Democrats need to return fire more often and just say, you know what, we got to do what we have to do to win. And I don't care if people like what we say or not, we have to win the races. So that's I'm on my soapbox now.
That's right.
So I'll tip my cap to Cramer for he's an opportunist.
Having that sort of pragmatic.
He's an opportunist, but a pragmatic one who just wants to win because he knows what can happen when you have power. Right. Okay. We need to wrap it up.
Okay.
You're awesome.
This is always fun.
You're
I love
awesome.
doing this.
Thank you, Tasha. Appreciate it. Tasha
Glad to be
Carvell,
here.
Forum reporter. You can read her work at inforum.com. Thank you for listening to the McFeely Mess podcast, and we will talk again very soon.
Thanks for listening to the McFeely Mess podcast at inforum.com. For more podcasts and columns, head to inforum.com and search Mike McFeely